Next up in Goats Doing Goat Shit is Joe Rogan, my unofficial podcasting mentor, as I know he is for so many others within his orbit. So for those of you who don't know, aside from being the host and creator of the largest podcast on the planet, and someone who's been on a couple of syndicated shows, as well as a top tier and most popular commentator for the UFC, Joe Rogan is also a stand-up comedian, and he was before all of that other stuff. It's his passion, his main thing to do, and he was a Comedy Store comic. The Comedy Store, for those of you that don't know, is the comedy mecca. It's the comedy club mecca. Any and all comics worth their salt, that's where they want to be. That's where they want to get past, especially on the West Coast. Here on the East Coast, in New York specifically, the closest to that is the Comedy Cellar. And there's actually a great documentary about the Comedy Store on Showtime that you all should check out. But in short, comedy has always had like highs and lows over the years in terms of like its popularity. But the Comedy Store has always been a constant in terms of being that place, the place where the heavy hitters go. And Rogan was a comic there, paid regular there. And there was this now infamous beef between him and Carlos Mencia. Carlos Mencia was a very popular comic back then, had like a Comedy Central TV show. And he's known to be a joke thief, like literally to the point where other comics would come up with ways to let other comics know by like turning on certain lights within the Comedy Store, to let other comics know, yo, Carlos Mencia is here. Don't use your good material when you're on stage, because they knew that he would just steal it and write it off as his own. So Rogan, being Rogan, confronted him publicly on stage after like so many other comics were literally robbed by Mencia, and he did so on stage in a now infamous clip that I'll try to find and link to it within the episode notes if you guys want to check it out. But pretty much Carlos Mencia went on stage defending himself. Rogan was there on stage with him. And Brian Redban, which was the person that started the Joe Rogan Experience podcast with Joe Rogan as his producer, which is the role that Jamie has now filled. He was there recording it on like his cell phone, like recording the incident. That's why we have the footage. Long story short, after this confrontation and other comics being like, yes, finally, somebody, like stood up for us, there was a new management at the Comedy Store because Mitzi was already like elderly and ill. Mitzi Shore, the person who started the Comedy Store, or actually not started rather, because it was started by her husband, but who gained the Comedy Store from the divorce and made it to what it became. At this point in time, even though, Rogan had his like Fear Factor and news radio syndication money and stuff like that, he wasn't the like cultural icon that he is today, right? And he wasn't as big of a comic. Meanwhile, Carlos Mencia was at the peak of its popularity. He was super popular around this time. And the Comedy Store management sided with Carlos Mencia. And this is even though, again, it was like a different management, but even though Rogan had, been there for years, and he himself like paid for like the sound system within the Comedy Store, and there's like other stories like that have been corroborated, and like they were under like the same management, apparently, Rogan and Mencia, so it was like a big thing. And his management even told Rogan that he should apologize to Mencia because Mencia is like the moneymaker for them or whatever, quote unquote, at that time. Rogan made the decision to, after telling them, and he tells the story, he's like, after telling them, are you sure that you want to, in this situation, back someone who's knowingly stealing from other comedians? You want to back a thief in this situation? And he had like the backing of every single comic there. They said yes. They went with Mencia. Rogan then decided to, either his management dropped him or he fired his management immediately, and he left the Comedy Store and vowed not to go back. That since obviously blew up in their management's face and the Comedy Store as well, because it became like a ghost town thereafter. And again, I wouldn't just attribute that to Rogan, because like I said before, comedy always has like ups and downs in terms of its popularity. But I'm sure that was a significant part of it, because other comics followed suit, like the Joey Diaz's, Tom Segura's, etc. But the Comedy Store is still the Comedy Store. It's still the mecca of comedy. And there was a comic by the name of Ari Shaffir. Shout out to Ari. Ari Shaffir, Skeptic Tank. Check it out. One of my favorite comics, despite the Kobe fiasco. Ari Shaffir, who started as a door guy at the Comedy Store, meaning working there like at the door to be able to get 5 minutes worth of stage time. Rogan used to take him and a lot of other door guys and people that worked at the Comedy Store on the road with him, like to open for him. And after, I think it was like 7 years or so of Rogan never going back to the Comedy Store, and during this time, the Joe Rogan podcast became, or was on its way to becoming what it is today, but was already like wildly popular. Ari Shaffir had worked his way up from being a door guy to obviously an opener, and then middling and becoming a headliner, and he was getting to shoot his first comedy special, and he actually shot it at the Comedy Store. And he obviously like wanted Rogan to be there, you know, being someone that was so impactful in his career. Carlos Mencia stole jokes from Ari as well, by the way. There's like back-to-back videos of their jokes online that you can find. And Rogan made the decision for such a special occasion to do so, to go back for Ari. And he didn't want the like attention to be on him going back, so he went back like a couple days before the actual shooting of the special, just to, you know, take the, I guess, like the attention away from him going back to the Comedy Store, away from him in time for when Ari shot his special. And then at that point, Comedy Store was under new management, which had previously, you know, for years tried to get Rogan to go back. But this actually made him finally go back. And then by this point, the Comedy Store and comedy in general, largely attributed, by the way, to the Joe Rogan Experience podcast and all the comics that he had on there, and telling comedy stories and stories of being on the road and stuff like that. Comedy was on the upswing again in terms of its popularity. But then it went to a point where it just blew up. And the Comedy Store, and a lot of this is covered in the documentary as well, was like on an Idle Tuesday, completely packed. Lines around the block. On any given night, you can see 10 different headliners that you would normally pay hundreds, if not thousands of dollars for, doing 15, 20-minute workout sets, etc. And sadly, due to COVID and all the shutdowns and like the Uber regulations within California, specifically LA, it's been shut down ever since for like over a year, with no like end in sight, even though like they tried, the Comedy Store management, because, you know, they serve food and stuff like that there, they tried to have it reopen, you know, do the whole outdoor thing, you know, through all the rules and regulations, following all of that, and maybe have a stage outside, outdoors, where folks could still perform comedy, but that wasn't allowed. And those strict, seemingly obtuse regulations that were imposed, even when folks were following the rules and regulations on the books, led folks like Rogan to leave LA. And a lot of comics followed suit. So Rogan relocated to Austin, Texas, and is on a mission to starting a new comedy mecca, if you will, in Austin. Because he doesn't want what was started and maintained for such a long time within the Comedy Store and in LA, the LA comedy scene, to die. Again, remember, it's his passion. It was his main thing to do before the podcast, before UFC, before all this other stuff. And he actually wants to open up a comedy club. And I've even heard him say like at cost and like not profit from it or whatever, which would be nuts and make zero business sense. But when you have fuck you money from Spotify, I guess it's not as much of a factor. Definitely one club, maybe even two, to have like a separate like workout club for like comics starting out. He definitely said at least 2 open mic nights and stuff like that. But anyway, the dope thing is that like a lot of like comedy is beginning to happen because you know, Texas is like less restrictive. And it's actually where Dave Chappelle, in the segment that I had of Goats Doing Goat Shit with Dave Chappelle and the whole Comedy Central Chappelle Show thing, where that was shot at Stubbs Barbecue, that was a part of like shows that Rogan and Chappelle do together, which, sidebar, like they were doing pre-pandemic, they were doing arenas together, headlining arenas together, stadiums together, Dave Chappelle and Joe Rogan. And the scene that he's establishing is such that Chappelle, who lives like remotely, like in Ohio somewhere, is even considering moving to Austin as well. But we'll see if that happens. I don't see that happening really. But other comics that have moved to Austin, which makes this comedy scene even more likely and more promising, are Brian Redban, Tony Hinchcliffe, Tom Segura, Christina Pazitsky, Tim Dillon, Burt Kreischer's on the fence, he's a maybe. Joey Diaz, Rogan offered to like buy him a house, move his whole family, all types of shit. But Joey actually moved out to here to the East Coast, back to Jersey, where he's from. Rogan's still holding out hope that after a winter or two, he's gonna say fuck this weather and move out to Austin. Theo Vaughn moved to Nashville. Andrew Schultz is currently in Florida. Supposedly, Hippocrates is saying that it's for, a couple months while it's cold in New York, but we'll see. But it's a lot of folks and a lot more that are supposedly going to make that move. And it's going to be really interesting to see what Rogan is able to build out there in Austin, Texas. And I'm excited for it. I'm excited for comedy and can't wait to see what's going to be coming down the pike. And that's Joe Rogan and goats doing goat shit.